So I don't know when this video is gonna come out, but it's gonna come out in a month where all the videos are gonna be about writing because this is another interview with another person who writes. This time, Molly.
Nice.
Welcome, heroes and villains, to Fjuke Enterprises YouTube channel. Take a moment, relax, stop your bickering, and just enjoy the show. What got you interested in writing?
Always been a fanciful storyteller and avid participant in various forms of pretend play, even as a young child, and I wanted to save those stories, so I began writing them down.
Do you write nonfiction, fiction, poetry?
I write all of the above, but mostly fiction and poetry. Fiction for storytelling, adventures, and poetry for digging into uncomfortable feelings.
So, which genres do you write in?
I mostly write medieval high fantasy. I like the freedom that comes with a world of my design that I can structure to aid in telling my story. One of the stories I'm writing about is The Country of Midnight, and its leadership and military prowess has equality for genders. And I've had some beta readers complain that it's not accurate, that women wouldn't be able to physically keep up because of different body structures, but I'm not writing this story to be historically accurate or to weigh in on debates about the physicality of women versus men. My stories tend to be gritty, but they're fantasy. Regarding poetry, I typically write lyrics, and I don't mean song lyrics, though rarely I have done that. A lyric is a poem that focuses on thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Typically, when I write poetry, I'm in a difficult place emotionally, and I find poems are a way for me to get the ick out of me and onto a page. It's a way to express what I'm feeling, even if I don't have someone physically able to listen to me.
What genres do you read, and why do you read those genres?
I read a myriad of genres, but mostly I gravitate towards fantasy stories. Some favorites include The Seven Realms by Chima, the classic Lord of the Rings, The Remnant Chronicles by Pearson, and His Fair Assassin by LaFaves. I also enjoy sci fi, mystery, adventures, and some graphic novels. I don't read all that much in the way of nonfiction. Certainly, I do have quite a few I've read, but comparatively, it's a tiny amount of my reading time.
Are you published?
Yeah, I've published a book. It's called Rightful, The Story of Thyrina Antir. It is self published, and I love the story, but I also wish I could go back and edit it more. Probably every author wishes they could. It follows a princess who is heir to the throne, but is blocked from ascension to queen by a variety of issues that she must overcome.
How did you come up with the idea for Rightful?
It actually started back in high school. A friend and I were writing different things together, and we would brainstorm and create characters. And I had two countries that I developed. One was, I called them fairies, but they were essentially like Lord of the Rings high elves. And then there was another country that was a human country. And we played around with this character we called her Theat at the time, which is a character from Alana by Tamora Pierce. Um, and so it was a little bit inspired by that character. And so we played around with it a bunch, and it ended up being a project I took on and wrote myself over the next many number of years. I dedicated the book to my friend that I originally brainstormed the very beginnings of the concept with.
Is the theme of Rightful taking control of your own destiny? Is that the theme of the book?
It's one of the themes. I don't really operate specifically with a specific thematic goal, but I would say that that is definitely an involved piece, as she's originally in a place where she feels very powerless and she doesn't really do too much to actively make changes. Or when she does make changes and actively participate, it's not necessarily in the way that she needs to in order to succeed. And then as she grows and develops, she starts to realize that she needs to make a more active and direct approach to achieving her goal of ascending the throne, at which point she starts to become more concrete in her planning and strategy.
Do you have difficulty coming up with the names of your characters or cities and towns and other things?
Not usually. When I GM in Pathfinder, I do, because I'm generally just pulling up specific names for characters that I don't really know anything about, and I'm trying to build on the spot on occasion. But when it comes to writing, typically the names come to me as I go. They end up just naturally popping into my head as something that fits the character as I get to know them. I don't always name a character right away, but as I get to know them better, their name will typically just come to me.
Since you write so much, is it hard to watch media without overanalyzing it?
Very interesting question. I don't think I've been asked that before. My answer would have to be that it depends. Often, when I'm watching a show or reading a book, I'm simply able to turn off that part of my brain and relax and enjoy. Typically, one of the things that typically the problem is once something hits off enough for me to start paying attention, I cannot stop noticing flaws. My biggest question tends to be why are they doing this, or how are they getting away with this, which often is not adequately answered by world building and character development. To me, a great story is where characters are engaging and consistent and they act in a way that makes sense based on what we know about them, and the world reacts to them in a way that makes sense. There can be surprises, confusion, chaos, but if there's no reason behind it, then it stops being meaningful to me. A couple of examples that frustrated me were the Star Wars show Andor. It opens with him desperately looking for his sister. Then he never bothers looking again. Even when he's amassed resources and connections, he doesn't actually actively resume looking for her, which was really breaking for me. Another would be many of the Marvel movies. I really can't watch most of them because I get bored. There's a couple with an engaging story, but most, to me at least, come across as excuses for combat, which then extends way longer than is meaningful to me. I really actually like action movies and action scenes, but it has to be done for me in a way where I care about the outcome and not just they saved the world, but caring about the well-being of the individual main and supporting characters and what they're going through. And I don't feel like Marvel does that most of the time.
From what I understand, it sounds like you. From what I understand from what you just said, it sounds like when characters break the character, what the character's supposed to be, is when you start noticing flaws.
So it's one of those things where if the character makes sense to have forgotten about his sister, if it had addressed that he gave up looking for her for some reason, then it would make sense that he stops looking for her. But in this case, it just drops that story. And there's like a couple offhand comments about, oh, she's probably dead from a couple people, but it never really addresses his grief for that. It never really shows him trying to figure out if she's actually dead. It just doesn't bother picking up that story again, which is presented in the opening as this is why you care about this character because he cares about his sister. And then they never bring it back.
Do you have beta or alpha readers for your works? If so, were they hard to find?
Alpha and beta readers are easy to find. Good alpha and beta readers are much more difficult. There's a Reddit I came across recently for beta reading that I've been enjoying, and there's some great stories I've been able to beta read for other writers, as well as receive some helpful feedback for stories I'm working on. Unfortunately, there's always going to be the challenge of getting feedback that is helpful to the story you're trying to tell for the audience you're targeting. So often the feedback is not necessarily helpful because it's from someone who's not your target audience and is commenting on things that are intentionally done, and they don't like that you did it that way. Now, sometimes that's very helpful to realize, okay, I need to stop and revisit this. But other times it's like, well, I don't think bath bombs existed in the Middle Ages. Well, A, it's a fantasy, and B, bath bombs are just cornstarch and, sorry, baking soda and like scent, which both existed back then. So whether or not they accurately existed in our world's Middle Ages, when you're creating a fantasy, those types of rules are a lot looser. And so sometimes there's that frustration of you're not really giving me feedback that is beneficial. You're focusing on these things that are part of the fantasy world that don't have to exist realistically in when we had the Middle Ages. I've also frequently had people start and then not finish something I've asked them to read for me, or they give me incredibly vague feedback, such as, it's good, which doesn't give me anything I can work from in terms of what made it good, what made it bad, why did it stick out to you, what specific scenes and what specific parts of those scenes were meaningful. So that can be really challenging to get feedback that actually helps develop. When I beta read, I often just try to say, this doesn't make sense to me, or why is he doing this, or why is he doing that? And I'm trying to not do it like a why is this happening, but so much as I'm not getting enough information as to why this character wants to do this. Can you give me some more information on that to make the story a bit more full?
Do you have that argument that this isn't how it would be in the Middle Ages when you run Pathfinder at all? Have you ever run into the players that act like that?
Not that specifically. I have had players that want to teleport in various elements of our world's history or a fantasy. I had one person who was a huge fan of the Greek gods and Riordan. I don't know how to say his name correctly. That just loved that guy. Unfortunately, I'm not running a Greek medieval or whatever era that was. I don't know. I don't. Anyway, I'm not running a Greek fantasy story. So he kept trying to say, well, my deity is this Greek deity. And I'm like, well, that deity doesn't exist in the Pathfinder world. So there has been conflict about that where they want to tell their story, it's complicated because with Pathfinder, you want to tell and let your characters tell the story of what their character is and what they believe, but that has to fit with the overarching world that you've created. So often that's really easy because it's more interpersonal conflict or self conflict where they're dealing with overcoming various things. One of my characters is a sorcerer who every time she's used fire spells, which is her specialty, something bad has happened. So now she's afraid of using fire spells. So that's a conflict that's ended up created by the story, but it fits in the world, as opposed to having a Greek god show up and he keeps being like, well, this Greek god shows up. Well, you don't get to decide about the deities. You only get to decide about what your character is doing in response to the existing physical and fantasy world that's there. So that's been the biggest challenge for me with GMing is sometimes players have trouble accepting that they can't add whatever they want to the world, that they're only specifically adding their character to the world that already exists.
Do you, back on topic, do you have an editor? If so, were they hard to find?
I don't currently have an editor. I'd enjoy having one, but they generally cost money if you have a good one. And so far, I've simply worked with beta readers and edited my own stories as I go through them. When I have something that I think is ready to publish, I will hire an editor for polish, which I did in the past with Rightful as well. Mostly that editing was type editing. I don't technically have dyslexia, but I do have problems with like swapping words and spelling. So um, I did need an editor to fix some of that. It's one of those ones where it is also beneficial to have an editor that can help you brainstorm ideas. So far, I've just been doing that with friends, but it can be helpful to have an editor if you're able to afford one that'll go and ask those why questions and push you and make points if any of the characters seem to be going off, where their character makes sense, if you're slipping in their characterization.
As my penultimate question, do you have any advice for your fellow writers out there?
My advice would be to observe, write, and play. Practicing anything is how you progress. I often struggle with skipping details, but that's something that is frequently what makes a story immersive. So I've been practicing by doing short descriptive works that focus on one small thing. Like the other night, I put a glass of Di Serono on the rocks and I put it on the table, and the glass was sweating, and I just played with it. There's no important story attached to it. There's no specific purpose to writing something about this glass of Di Serono, except that I'm seeing how I can capture the moment. And I might at some point pull some of that description in to describe a glass of alcohol if that ever comes up in a story. But that wasn't the purpose of it. It was just to play with words and to notice the details of what was happening and how things were interacting and to find different ways of describing that. One of my other tricks, it's specifically for writer's block, is I tell side stories. I pull them in. I tend to pull them out when I'm editing the work because you want it to be focused as opposed to having all these different various side stories, which my little sister gets very mad about because she likes my side characters. And when she's reading works for me, she's like, but why? I liked this character. I'm like, sorry. But it does keep you in the world you've created, as well as gives you a better idea of how the various side characters would be interacting in a way that makes them feel more alive and realistic. And it also will often give you ideas of how to continue the main story arc because you can see how various people are interacting with the world and then put your main story into that. Another idea is bouncing different things off of friends or fellow writers or the beta reader group. Maeve is one of my characters that seems everyone loves and identifies with. She's one of my characters in Rightful and some of the other ones I'm working on. She seems to be their favorite. And without giving spoilers, I completely blame my little brother for the events that made her who she is. I was struggling with what my characters would do while they were holed up for the winter. And I was just complaining about that. He made a suggestion and it completely altered her character in a wonderful, wonderful way that has made her very unique and very meaningful. So I think just talking to people about what you're working on is helpful. Obviously, not everyone wants to hear you brainstorm all the time about your ideas, but if you have people that are into that, having those conversations can be really great.
My final question is basically a chance to soapbox about whatever you would like, because I'm asking you to shout out anything or anyone you would like at this time.
I'm going to shout out my little sister. I'm just trying to find her YouTube specifically. She goes by Kier Scrivener. YouTube. Kier the Scrivener on YouTube. So it's at KIERTHECR. Sorry. THESCRIVENER. She does a lot of great book reviews. She's into middle grade and historical works. And if you're writing or reading or just interested in stories in general and how they impact people, she actually does a lot of breakdowns on different things that she likes and dislikes, which I find is great. She's also a person with a disability and some other history as well as a degree in counseling. So she's often able to look at the impacts of the writing and how they impact whether or not they're accurate in terms of emotional distress, physical distress, disability, and whether or not they're handling those things in a way that's beneficial. I'll also just shout out my book. It's called Rightful, the story of Thyrina Antjer. It is a young adult middle medieval fantasy, and it's aimed at older teens or young 20s, as there is a few darker scenes that deal with more difficult topics, but it's not really a super complex story that would be more of an adult fiction. I think it's fun. I think it needs some editing because I always think it needs editing, but I think it is a great and fun story. And then, of course, there's my websites. There's Ella Meadows at ellameadows.wordpress.com and stereapathfinder.wordpress.com, where I share what I'm working on. So if people are interested in any of those projects, they're welcome to check them out.
All those links to check out the YouTube channel or Molly's stuff will be in the description of this video, as well as the link to my Discord if you just want to hang out with Molly. And we'll see you in the next video.
Thank you for the interview, and I hope everyone has a lovely day.